Imagine silence. Not the kind broken by the distant hum of a city or the rustle of leaves. Imagine the absolute, primordial silence of the permafrost. It is a silence sealed for millennia. A silence in which time itself is frozen. Somewhere deep beneath the Alaskan tundra, in ice cores pulled from a depth of 40 meters, this silence found a voice. At first, it was a barely audible whisper in the microscopes of the Permafrost Research Institute at the University of Fairbanks. Then that whisper became a deafening scream that echoed through all the world's leading scientific journals, an event that journalists rushed to christen the Alaskan Awakening. The official version, which you've undoubtedly heard, sounds simple, logical, and frightening. Global warming. The relentless rise in the average annual temperature by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, about 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, in the Arctic latitudes is doing its work. The ancient ice, this great sarcophagus of the planet, has begun to thaw, and from their icy prison, like genies from a bottle, they began to emerge. Paleoviruses. Microorganisms that had been in suspended animation for tens, even hundreds of thousands of years. Newspaper headlines screamed about zombie viruses, about a Pandora's box that was opening a new threat of unseen pandemics before humanity. Both the World Health Organization and leading virology centers stated in one voice, "This is a tragic but completely natural process, a side effect of our own activities. We heated the planet, and now it's paying us back in the form of microscopic monsters from the past. A beautiful, coherent, and most importantly, convenient theory. It gives us an enemy we know, climate change, and it gives us a solution, albeit a difficult one, to fight this change." But what if this coherent theory is just a facade? A carefully constructed set, hiding something far stranger and more disturbing? What if the awakening of these viruses is not a gradual, predictable process, but something else? Something more like the flick of a switch. To understand where the first crack in this story appears, you need to dive into the data. Not the beautiful, smoothed-out graphs shown in presentations at climate summits, but the raw, unprocessed streams of telemetry from hundreds of monitoring stations scattered across the entire Arctic. NOAA's Cryosphere Monitoring Network collects gigabytes of information around the clock. Soil temperature at various depths, the rate of ice melt, methane levels in the atmosphere, and, most importantly for us, the concentration of microbiological activity in air and water samples. For years, for decades, this data painted the same picture, a slow, almost lazy increase. The curve crept upward, following the curve of global temperature. Everything was predictable, boring, until a certain moment, until 12 May 2024. At 3:14 a.m. Coordinated Universal Time, something happened that was not in any model. All sensors, from the north slope of Alaska to the Yukon, over an area of several million square kilometers, simultaneously recorded a spike. Not a rise, not a surge, a spike. Imagine a cardiogram that has shown a steady, slow pulse for years, and suddenly a vertical, almost perfect line appears, going off the scale. The level of microbial activity in water samples from the Yukon, Kuskokwim, and Colville rivers grew by thousands of times, in a matter of minutes. This didn't look like thawing. Thawing is an inert, gradual process. This looked like a detonation, as if someone or something passed over this vast territory and gave the command, "Wake up." Official reports published weeks later blamed it on a cascading failure in the sensor network. They called it a timestamp synchronization error. They took this monstrous peak, statistically smeared it over the preceding months, and once again produced a beautiful, smooth graph. The problem was solved. The anomaly was buried in the footnotes of a 125-page technical report, but they couldn't delete the raw data from all the archives. For those who knew where to look, This digital scream was still audible, and it asked a single question. What really happened in those fateful minutes? And now, let's transport ourselves from the icy Alaskan tundra to the cold, ringing emptiness of space. A few months before the Alaskan awakening, the world's astronomical agencies announced the discovery of a new interstellar visitor, an object designated 3I Atlas, the third interstellar object in history detected in our solar system after the famous Oumuamua and Comet Borisov. It was spotted by the Atlas Automated Sky Survey in Hawaii. At first it seemed like just another faint comet, but the longer they watched it, the stranger it behaved. First, its trajectory. It was perfectly hyperbolic, indicating its extrasolar origin. It came from the direction of the constellation Lyra, from the deep interstellar darkness, and was supposed to, after looping around the sun, leave us forever, flying off towards the constellation Columba. A classic transit, but there was an anomaly in its movement. A small but steady non-gravitational acceleration. The official explanation stated it was the result of outgassing, the evaporation of ices from its surface under the influence of solar heat, creating a rocket-like thrust. This is how all comets behave. But the spectral analysis of 3I Atlas, conducted by the James Webb Space Telescope, showed something strange. There was almost no water ice or frozen carbon dioxide on its surface. The main jets pushing it consisted of superheated hydrogen and nitrogen, which is completely atypical for comets. Moreover, these jets turned on and off with a certain periodicity, as if operating on some internal schedule. Second, its composition. Spectrographs showed the presence of heavy metals, osmium and iridium, in concentrations tens of times higher than any known asteroids or comets. Its nucleus was incredibly dense. NASA, in its press release, cautiously called it a unique representative of the protoplanetary disk of another star system. But on private forums for amateur astronomers analyzing the published data, another word circulated: artifact. This object did not behave like a dead piece of rock and ice. It behaved like a machine. And this is where it gets truly strange. On 12 May 2024, on the very same day and hour that the sensors in Alaska went haywire, Object 3I Atlas made its perihelion, its closest approach to the sun. But that's not all. At that moment, its trajectory passed almost directly over the North Pole of the Earth. It flew over the polar cap at a distance of 150 million kilometers, about 93 million miles, in a perfect position for, what? Coincidence? Or choreography? Official science answers this question unequivocally: coincidence. And it's logical. From the system's point of view, any other answer would be madness. Imagine the scale of that statement. To admit that an interstellar object flying over the planet could somehow influence microbiological activity on its surface, it sounds like the plot of a cheap science fiction movie. There's no mechanism known to science capable of such a thing. What kind of radiation could pass through the atmosphere, the magnetosphere, tens of meters of soil and ice, and selectively turn on only certain types of microorganisms over a gigantic territory? The object's gravitational influence at such a distance is negligible. Electromagnetic? The sun radiates billions of times more energy in any band. Any serious scientist who dared to publicly suggest such a connection would immediately lose their reputation, grants, and career. Therefore, the scientific consensus was formed instantly and was ironclad. The event in Alaska is the result of climate change. The anomalies of 3I Atlas are simply gaps in our knowledge about comets from other star systems. These two events occurred simultaneously by pure chance, a statistical fluctuation. End of story. The World Health Organization issued a directive on the need to strengthen monitoring of pathogens in areas of permafrost thaw. NASA published another paper on the unusual outgassing processes of Comet 3I Atlas. The world calmed down. The problem was localized, explained, and placed in a neat little box labeled climate risks. But for those who are not afraid to ask inconvenient questions, this simplicity was the biggest warning sign. When the system so quickly and unanimously finds a simple explanation for two extremely complex and synchronous anomalies, it means one of two things. Either they truly understand everything, or they are desperately trying to hide the fact that they understand absolutely nothing. Or even worse, they understood what was happening, and the scale of this discovery is so monstrous that the truth must be hidden at all costs. They offered us a simple, convenient explanation. But the numbers didn't add up. And the silence that followed was far too deafening. To crack the code of the official version, you first need to understand the language it's written in. And that language is one of soothing, lulling complexity. The system never lies directly. It builds labyrinths of plausible facts in which any anomaly gets lost like a lone traveler. Let's walk through this labyrinth together to see where exactly they hid the key. The official explanation for the awakening of the zombie viruses rests on three fundamental pillars: the mechanism of permafrost thaw, the nature of virus survival in ice, and the law of large numbers. It sounds solid. Let's examine each of them under a microscope. First, the process of thawing itself. It's presented to us as something uniform, like an ice cube melting in a glass. But reality, as always, is infinitely more complex. The permafrost is not a monolithic block of ice. It is a highly complex geological structure consisting of intermingled layers of ice, frozen soil, rocks, and organic remains. It has a so-called active layer, the top 1 to 2 meters that thaws every summer and freezes in winter. Global warming causes this active layer to penetrate deeper each year, like a hot knife through butter, eating away at the body of the permafrost. This process triggers a chain reaction. The thawing of ice lenses leads to ground subsidence, the formation of thermokarst lakes, and giant craters, vast sinkholes the locals call the gates to the underworld. Coastlines cemented by ice collapse into the Arctic Ocean, carrying away millions of metric tons of ancient soil. It's a slow, dramatic, and absolutely real process. And it is, without a doubt, releasing a huge amount of dormant microbiota. The second pillar is the ability of viruses to survive. And here, official science is absolutely correct. Ice is the perfect natural cryopreserver. The lack of oxygen, low temperature, and darkness create conditions in which complex organic molecules, including DNA and RNA, can be preserved almost forever. Back in 2014, French scientists led by Jean-Michel Claverie and Chantal Abergel managed to revive a giant virus, Pithovirus cybericum, which had spent 30,000 years in the permafrost. They later repeated their success with Mollivirus cybericum. These viruses, fortunately, only infect amoebas. But the very fact of their resurrection proved that the icy prison keeps its inmates in perfect condition. They don't die. They just wait. And as their prison melts, they are set free. This fact is undeniable and serves as a powerful argument for the official version. And finally, the third pillar, the law of large numbers. The permafrost territory in Alaska and Canada covers millions of square kilometers. Across this gigantic area, the thawing process is uneven, faster in some places, slower in others. The official theory states that with such a huge sample size, local spikes are inevitable. In one place, a particularly organic-rich layer was exposed. In another, a thermokarst lake connected to a river system. In a third, a landslide occurred. And when you sum up thousands of such local, random events, you can get an overall increase in microbial activity. And that peak on May 12th? It's just a statistical artifact, they claim, the result of several large but independent events overlapping, amplified by an error in the data collection network. Everything is logical. Everything is explainable. Each link in this chain seems strong. But when you look at the entire chain, you notice something that shouldn't be there. You notice the ghost of synchronicity. It is synchronicity that shatters this entire majestic edifice of official logic. Imagine 1,000,000 candles scattered across a huge field. The theory of global warming is like a slow increase in the air temperature in this field. Yes, over time, all the candles will begin to melt. Some faster, some slower, depending on their composition and location. But they will never, under any circumstances, all ignite at the same instant. And the data from the monitoring stations speaks of exactly that. Not of melting, of ignition. To understand the scale of this anomaly, you need to picture this network of sensors. These aren't just thermometers in the ground. They are complex autonomous systems. A station near Utqiagvik on the coast of the Chukchi Sea. A complex on a research island in the Yukon Delta. Posts near research centers scattered thousands of kilometers apart. They have different power sources, solar panels, wind turbines, radioisotope generators. They have different communication channels, iridium satellite modems, shortwave radio transmitters. They are in different geological conditions. The depth of freezing at these points differs by tens of meters. The rate of local thawing can vary by orders of magnitude. And yet, at 3:14 a.m. GMT, their hydrochemical analyzers, taking samples from rivers and meltwater, and their mass spectrometers, analyzing the composition of the surface air, simultaneously showed an exponential growth in the concentration of complex organic compounds characteristic of microbial life. Synchronicity with the precision of a minute, over a territory comparable in size to the entire West Coast. The official explanation for this phenomenon is a cascading timestamp synchronization failure. It sounds very technical and convincing to anyone who hasn't built distributed networks. The idea is that a single central server, responsible for assigning the correct time to all data packets, failed. And because of this, data from several weeks or months was mistakenly tagged with the same minute, creating the illusion of a peak. But this version falls apart under the first serious analysis. First, such critical systems always have multiple redundancies. Not one time server, but 3, located in different data centers. Second, each autonomous post has its own GPS module, which is an independent and absolutely accurate source of time. The data collection protocol is designed so that if the central server is unavailable, the timestamp is taken from the GPS. For such an error to occur, all central servers and the GPS receivers on hundreds of stations would have to fail simultaneously. The probability of such an event is mathematically indistinguishable from zero. But let's assume for a second that this miracle happened. What could cause such a total failure? The only candidate is a cosmic scale event. For example, a massive solar flare, comparable to the Carrington event of 1859. Such a flare could indeed knock out electronics and GPS satellites. But where are the accompanying effects? Where are the auroras over Florida and Hawaii? Where are the massive failures in other satellite constellations, in global communication systems, in power grids? None of this was recorded on May 12th. The sun was quiet. The Earth's magnetosphere was calm. This was not an external blow. It was an internal event that affected only this specific network of sensors in this specific territory. And that makes the official explanation not just unlikely. It makes it absurd. And it's here, at this point, where official science hits a dead end and asks us to believe in a technical miracle, that the first alternative source comes on stage. a voice from the outside that the system couldn't silence. This wasn't data from amateur astronomers or insiders. It was a report from a small research group at Aachen Technical University in Germany, which we'll call the Aachen Group. They had nothing to do with virology or climatology. They were physicists, specialists in quantum magnetometry. For several years, they had been running a pilot project in the Yukon in collaboration with a local institute. They were testing a new technology, a network of highly sensitive sensors capable of detecting ultra-low frequency changes in the Earth's magnetic field. Their goal was to learn to predict seismic activity and map the flows of sub-permafrost groundwater. Their equipment was completely autonomous, not connected to NOAA's cryosphere monitoring network. Their servers were in Germany, and they weren't measuring temperature or microbes. They were measuring the field. And here's what they found. On May 12th, at 3:11 a.m. GMT, 3 minutes before the peak on the microbial sensors, their magnetometers recorded something incredible. A short, but extremely powerful pulse. It didn't resemble the natural fluctuations of Earth's magnetism. The pulse's signature was coherent, monochromatic, with a carrier frequency in the extremely low frequency range, around 3 kilohertz. The source of this pulse, according to triangulation data from their 3 stations, was not in the Earth's crust, and not in the ionosphere. It came from above, from space, and it blanketed their entire research area, causing a brief but intense excitation of water molecules trapped in the ice's crystal lattice. Their report was purely technical. The Aachen physicists drew no conclusions about viruses. They simply stated a fact. An anomalous transmission of directed energy of unknown origin was recorded, which had a physical effect on the upper layers of the permafrost. The Aachen Group, as conscientious scientists do, wrote a paper and sent it to a leading geophysics journal, and it was rejected. The reviewers cited insufficient data for such bold conclusions, and the absence of a known physical mechanism that could explain such a phenomenon. They were asked to perform additional checks on their equipment. They were politely asked to be quiet. But the most interesting part is the timeline. They sent the preliminary results of their research to their American colleagues under an exchange program at the end of May. And the official NOAA report, in which the explanation about the cascading sensor failure first appeared, was published only in mid-June. That is, the system already knew about the recorded energy pulse when it was creating its smokescreen of synchronization errors. They didn't just make a mistake in their assessment. They encountered inconvenient data that didn't fit any existing model, data that pointed to an external artificial influence, and made a conscious decision to ignore it. Moreover, they created a counter-narrative, a false technical explanation, to preemptively discredit any future leaks. The issue wasn't that their model was wrong. The issue was that they faced a fact that shattered the very foundation of their worldview, and they chose to protect the worldview, not to acknowledge the fact. And that's no longer a mistake. It's a choice. It's the first act of a cover-up. The official report wasn't an analytical document. It was a wall. An information firewall, hastily erected to shield the scientific community and the public from a terrifying truth. The awakening in the Arctic was not an accident. It was an activation. And someone or something from space had just pulled the trigger. When the wall of the official explanation cracks, the investigation moves to a new level. It leaves the physical world of Arctic ice and magnetometer readings and enters the digital world, the realm of information. And it is here, in the cold, silent corridors of global data archives, that we find not just a discrepancy, we find a ghost in the machine. To understand its nature, you must first realize what modern scientific archives are. They are not just giant warehouses for files. They are digital cathedrals, temples of transparency, built on the belief that knowledge belongs to everyone. The MAST archive, the Mikulski archive for space telescopes, is the holy of holies of astronomy. Every byte of information received from telescopes like Hubble or James Webb, after a short period of exclusive access for the research group that requested the observation, becomes public domain. Anyone on the planet, from a Nobel laureate to a high school student in Mumbai, can enter this digital cathedral, request the raw data, and conduct their own research. This is a fundamental principle of modern science. Transparency, reproducibility, the collective search for truth. The system built this temple and set the rules within it. And one rule is inviolable. All data must be accounted for. You can delay its publication, you can accompany it with a commentary about possible artifacts, but you cannot simply delete a fragment of the universe's history. That would be sacrilege. And it is precisely this sacrilege that we discovered. Our object of intense scrutiny is the interstellar visitor 3I Atlas. Naturally, as soon as its uniqueness became apparent, it became the #1 target for all major observatories. And of course, the sharpest eye of humanity was aimed at it, the James Webb Space Telescope. Under observation program GO 2788, requested by a consortium of European astronomers, Webb was scheduled to conduct a long observation session of the object precisely during the period of its perihelion. The goal was simple but ambitious, to obtain the most detailed spectra of its coma and nucleus to date. The NIR spec instrument was to break down its faint light into thousands of shades to determine the exact chemical composition of the gases it was emitting. And the MIRI instrument, operating in the mid-infrared range, was to measure the thermal signature of the nucleus itself, to understand its temperature, size, and perhaps even its surface structure. It was a unique opportunity to look under the hood of an interstellar wanderer. And Webb did its job. The data from program GO 2788, as expected, began to appear in the MAST archive a few weeks after the observations. File by file, gigabyte by gigabyte, and thousands of researchers worldwide, both professional and amateur, rushed to download and analyze them. And that's when things got strange. One independent analyst, hiding under the nickname Event Horizon Seeker, on a private forum for astronomical data processing, noticed an anomaly. Not in the image itself, but in the metadata. In the telemetry stream that accompanied the observations, there was a gap. A perfectly straight, clean gap lasting 27 minutes and 14 seconds. It looked as if someone had cut a piece of film out of a movie. Before the gap, there was perfect data. After the gap, there was perfect data. And the gap itself was an absolute void. It didn't look like a standard transmission error. When data packets are lost during transmission from the telescope to Earth via the Deep Space Network, it leaves traces. Artifacts appear, corrupted pixels, empty rows and tables. The archiving system automatically flags such files as corrupted or incomplete. But this was different. The files were not flagged as damaged. They simply weren't there. As if for those 27 minutes the telescope had ceased to exist. As if someone, or something, had covered its lens with an invisible hand. The official explanation, which appeared in a service memo on the Space Telescope Science Institute website after an uproar began on the forums, was extremely concise. Technical malfunction in the data recording module. It was claimed that due to a brief failure of the onboard computer, a fragment of the observations was not saved to the solid-state drive. An irreversible loss. It happens. Space is a hostile environment. But for those who understand how James Webb works, this explanation sounded like a bad joke. Webb is arguably the most complex and reliable machine ever built by humanity. Its computer systems have quadruple redundancy. Every byte of information is duplicated and checked multiple times before being written. The probability of a failure that would result not in an error code, but in the clean, traceless disappearance of a 27-minute block of data from several instruments simultaneously approaches zero. It's like claiming that in a perfectly guarded bank vault, 27 bills vanished from the middle of a stack, leaving no signs of a break-in or fingerprints, while all surveillance cameras were undergoing technical maintenance at that exact moment. But the most important thing is, once again, the time. When exactly did this technical malfunction occur? You've already guessed it. The missing observation fragment perfectly to the second covers the very time interval in which the Aachen Group's magnetometers detected the energy pulse, and the sensors in Alaska screamed about the awakening of the viruses. This was not a coincidence. This was choreography. A perfectly executed symphony of silence. What if they found something and hid it from us? This hypothesis, initially seeming paranoid, now acquired a sinister logic. The absence of data was no longer just an absence. It became a piece of evidence, a negative imprint, the ghost of an event so important that to conceal it, the system was willing to take an unprecedented step, to violate the sanctity of its own digital temple. They didn't just hide the data. They created a plausible but false technical cover story. And that changes everything. It means they not only had something to hide, but they also had time to figure out how to do it. This wasn't a panic reaction. It was a planned operation. They saw something, realized it couldn't be shown to the world, and neatly, with surgical precision, they removed it from reality, leaving in its place a smooth scar, invisible to most. This was not a mistake. It was an excision. Digital surgery on a planetary scale. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was the answer. The answer to what the James Webb Space Telescope saw in those 27 missing minutes. And now the main question has shifted from, did a cover-up happen? To, what exactly did they hide? What could be so anomalous, so shocking, as to force NASA and ESA to commit fraud on this level? What did the most powerful telescope in human history see when it turned its gaze on 3I Atlas at the very moment it was supposedly sending its awakening signal to the Siberian viruses? The answers to this question can only lie in the realm of speculation. But these are not blind guesses. They are speculations based on the crumbs of information we have. We know that MIRI was measuring the thermal signature. We know that NIR-SPEC was analyzing the chemical composition. We know that a powerful, coherent energy pulse of extremely low frequency was detected. Putting these three facts together, we can build a hypothesis. What if Webb didn't just record the passive reflection of sunlight from an icy comet nucleus? What if, in those 27 minutes, 3I Atlas stopped being a comet? Imagine a thermal map of the object. Normally it should show a smooth gradient. One side facing the sun, slightly warmer. The other, in shadow, ice cold. But what if MIRI's instruments saw something else? A sudden, localized, and symmetrical increase in temperature at specific points on the nucleus's surface. Not chaotic, like a geyser eruption, but orderly, as if powerful energy sources beneath its rocky shell briefly turned on. And what did NIR-SPEC see? Officially, it only saw traces of hydrogen and nitrogen. But what if, in those 27 minutes, the spectrum changed? What if lines appeared corresponding not to natural elements, but to complex, perhaps artificial, compounds? What if the spectrometer detected a short but intense emission of particles, modulated by that very 3 kilohertz signal the Germans picked up? What if the object wasn't just outgassing? What if in those 27 minutes it transmitted? What if Webb, with its incredible sensitivity, saw not just a comet, but a working transmitter? Saw an interstellar artifact deploying its broadcasting equipment, aiming at Earth, and sending a single, powerful pulse intended to activate something that had been sleeping in our own ice for millennia. This discovery would change everything. It would transform 3I Atlas from a passive astronomical curiosity into an active, purposeful agent. It would prove not just the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence, but its direct interference in Earth's biosphere. And the realization of this fact, that is the reason that could force the system to do anything to bury those 27 minutes forever. The silence was not accidental. It was a quarantine. A quarantine for knowledge too dangerous to be released. When the system erects a wall of silence, it makes one fatal mistake. It assumes it controls all channels of information, that all eyes looking at the sky are connected to its central server. But the universe is vast, and human curiosity is boundless, and there will always be someone looking at the world through a different lens, someone who cannot be switched off, whose access cannot be blocked, whose data cannot be lost. In our investigation, this role was played not by a world-renowned scientist or a government insider. This role was played by a man the system would never have taken seriously, and that is precisely why he was able to see what they were so desperately trying to hide. His name is Stefan Burns, a resident of a small town in the Austrian Alps, a former optical engineer, and now a retiree, and one of the most respected amateur astronomers in Europe. Stefan doesn't work for NASA. He doesn't have access to the James Webb Space Telescope, but he has something else. In his backyard, under the sliding roof of a homemade observatory, stands his greatest treasure, a 32-inch reflector telescope he spent nearly 20 years building and perfecting. But its main feature is not the size of its mirror. It's the unique spectroscopy system that Stefan designed himself. While most amateurs are content with beautiful photos of nebulae, Burns is obsessed with light. He catches faint photons from distant objects and, like a jeweler, breaks them down into spectral lines, trying to read their secret chemical messages. When 3I Atlas appeared in the news, Stefan Burns, like thousands of other enthusiasts, pointed his telescope at it. But he did it differently from everyone else. Most observers worked in the visible spectrum. But Stefan, thanks to his engineering background, modified his sensors to work in the near-infrared spectrum, the very same range where James Webb operates. Of course, his modest ground-based telescope couldn't compare in sensitivity to the space giant. The Earth's atmosphere is a noisy, murky filter that distorts and absorbs most of the signal. But Stefan had an advantage that not even Webb had: time. He could observe the object for hours, night after night, accumulating the signal, pulling the faintest details out of the cosmic noise. And he was patient. He began his observation campaign in late April and continued it until mid-May, every clear night methodically recording the spectra of 3I Atlas. And on the night of May 12th to 13th, precisely at the time when Webb was experiencing its mysterious glitch and the Arctic sensors were going haywire, the small telescope in the Austrian Alps kept watching, and it saw. What Stefan Burns recorded was not a clear image of a working transmitter, which Webb might have seen. It was something much more subtle, a ghost, an echo of that same event. In his data, after many hours of processing and noise reduction, he discovered an anomaly. Throughout all the previous nights, the spectrum of 3I Atlas had been stable and boring, a faint reflected line of sunlight and barely perceptible emission lines of hydrogen. But in that short period of time, around 3:15 a.m. GMT, a new detail appeared in the object's spectrum for a few minutes. A barely noticeable but statistically significant hump in the part of the infrared range that corresponds to the vibrations of molecular bonds in complex silicate structures. To put it simply, his instrument detected a brief burst of microscopic dust. This in itself wouldn't have been extraordinary. Comets constantly eject dust, but the devil, as always, was in the details. Analysis of the shape of this hump showed that the dust particles had very strange properties. They were not chaotically shaped like normal cometary dust, but had an almost uniform size and, most strikingly, a crystalline, ordered structure. This was not just dust. These were microcrystals, and their spectral signature was strangely similar to the spectrum of artificial zeolites, porous materials used on Earth as catalysts and molecular sieves. It was as if the object had briefly sneezed a cloud of microscopic artificial particles. By itself, this fact, though strange, was not yet a smoking gun. But Stephen Burns was not just an observer. He was a detective. He began searching archives for other observations of Three-Eye Atlas made on the same night by other amateurs. And he found one. A group of students from an observatory in Argentina, working on the other side of the planet, had been conducting photometry of the object that same night, measuring its brightness. In their data, published on a preprint server, there was a strange footnote. They noted that at approximately the same time Burns recorded his spectral hump, the object's brightness inexplicably and briefly dropped by a few hundredths of a stellar magnitude. The effect was so faint that they attributed it to measurement error to passing clouds. But Burns understood it was no error. He connected the two dots. His spectrometer saw the cloud of dust, and the Argentinian's photometer saw that same cloud momentarily obscure the object's nucleus, causing its brightness to dip. This was independent confirmation. The event was real, and it perfectly filled the 27-minute gap that the system had so carefully scrubbed from Webb's archives. The data from a modest amateur telescope became the unexpected evidence that turned the hypothesis of a cover-up into a virtually proven fact. But the story didn't end there. Burns's discovery became a catalyst. When he published his findings on the same forum where the missing Webb data was first discussed, it triggered a chain reaction. Dozens of other amateur researchers around the world began to re-examine their old observations, searching for traces of this brief event, and they began to find them. Someone discovered a faint anomaly in the polarization of the object's light. Someone else, a barely perceptible change in its color. Each of these facts, taken individually, was too weak to serve as proof. But together they formed a single, consistent picture. At a specific moment on May 12th, Three-Eye Atlas underwent a short but powerful change. It wasn't just a gas eruption. It was a complex, multi-component event that included an energy pulse, the ejection of crystalline microparticles, and a change in the nucleus's optical properties. It looked more and more like the operation of a complex mechanism than the behavior of a piece of ice and rock. And the most frightening discovery was made when one of the analysts decided to check old data on the first interstellar visitor, Oumuamua. In one of the lesser-known data sets from the Spitzer Space Telescope, they found something similar, a short, barely noticeable spike in the infrared range, which at the time was dismissed as instrumental noise. But its characteristics were eerily similar to what Burns had recorded for Three-Eye Atlas. And this is where the picture began to take on a truly terrifying scale. The anomaly discovered by the Oracle from the Austrian Alps was not an isolated case. It was a signature, a repeating pattern of behavior. As if different objects, arriving from the depths of space years apart, were performing the same operation, leaving behind the same faint trace. This no longer looked like a coincidence. It looked like a protocol, a standard operating procedure. And if that's the case, a monstrous question arises. How many more such guests flew past us unnoticed before our telescopes became sensitive enough to see them? How many times has this protocol already been executed? And what exactly are they activating here on Earth, leaving their ghostly signatures in our telescope data? Stephen Burns's discovery didn't just fill a data gap. It opened a door into a much darker and deeper rabbit hole. It showed that we are dealing not with one strange object, but with a systematic, recurring activity. And if we are only seeing its faint echoes, what is the true scale and purpose of this activity? The answer to that question may be buried not only in the Arctic ice, but also in hundreds of terabytes of old, archived data that no one has ever checked for these ghostly signatures. Until today, when individual anomalies begin to form a pattern, an investigation ceases to be a search for a needle in a haystack. It becomes cartography. The task is no longer to find another strange event, but to connect the dots already found on the map to reveal the hidden design. We move from collecting evidence to constructing an architecture. The architecture of silence. Until now, we viewed the events of May 2024 as an isolated drama. The awakening in Alaska, the flyby of 3I Atlas, the gap in Webb's data, Stephen Burns' discovery, all occurred in a very narrow window of time. But what if this wasn't the first act of the play? What if it was the culmination, the finale of a long and quiet preparation that had been carried out for months, right in front of our eyes? To see this preparation, we need to broaden our time horizon. We need to create a timeline on which we plot not only the main events, but also the secondary, seemingly unrelated ones. And when we do, the chaos of random news headlines begins to transform into a frighteningly coherent score, an information cascade, where each preceding stream fed the next, ultimately merging into a single, powerful flow. The first point on our map, January 2023, 16 months before the main event. The scene is the heliosphere, the giant bubble blown by the sun that protects our system from harsh interstellar radiation. The protagonist is the Parker Solar Probe, the fastest object ever created by humans, which at that moment was making another close flyby of the sun, passing through its corona. Its mission is to touch the sun, to study the nature of the solar wind, the stream of charged particles that continuously flows from our star. And then, during its 14th orbit, Parker's instruments recorded something for which there is still no accepted explanation. For 4 hours and 22 minutes, the solar wind in the sector the probe was crossing virtually disappeared. It didn't weaken, it vanished. The proton density dropped to almost zero. The flow velocity decreased tenfold. The probe, flying through a plasma storm with a temperature of 1,000,000 degrees, suddenly found itself in a zone of almost absolute vacuum and silence. The official version, presented in a short paper in the Astrophysical Journal Letters, called it a localized plasma depletion event. Scientists suggested it was the result of a complex interaction of magnetic fields on the sun's surface, which created a temporary corridor of emptiness, a rare but natural phenomenon. But let's look at this event from another perspective, from a what-if point of view. What if this was not a natural corridor? The solar wind is not just an interference for radio communications. It is our primary shield. Any interstellar object entering the solar system must break through this continuous storm. What if our visitor, 3I Atlas, which was still far beyond Neptune's orbit at that time but already moving towards us, needed a clean, interference-free channel? What if this brief calming of the solar wind was not an accident, but a deliberate action? As if someone momentarily turned off the jammer to ensure a clear passage for something important that was about to enter the system. This idea sounds fantastic, but it provides an explanation for what official science cannot. The perfect synchronicity and locality of this corridor, which, as calculations show, opened up precisely on the path of 3I Atlas, the second point on our map, October 2023. 7 months before the main event. The scene is not space, but the digital heart of our civilization. The Global Domain Name System, DNS. This is the invisible infrastructure that translates human-readable website names like Google.com into machine-readable IP addresses. Without DNS, the internet ceases to exist. And on October 22nd, for 6 hours, This system experienced the most massive outage in its history. Billions of requests worldwide began returning errors. Websites stopped opening. Messaging apps went silent. Cloud services on which corporations and governments depend went offline. It was a global digital paralysis. The official explanation, released by ICANN, the corporation that oversees DNS, stated the cause was a cascading failure caused by an incorrect update of cryptographic keys on several of the 13 root servers. A technical glitch. Human error. But cybersecurity analysts on private forums noted oddities. The outage was too comprehensive, too synchronous. It didn't look like a normal error. It looked like a perfectly coordinated attack. Or a drill. What if it wasn't a failure? What if it was a test? A global stress test designed to identify the weakest points in the world's information network. Or more alarmingly, what if it was a smokescreen? 6 hours of digital blindness and silence, during which any amount of data could be transmitted or received, any operation conducted on the global network, and no one would be able to track it because all monitoring systems were paralyzed. It was the perfect opportunity for the ghost in the machine to act unnoticed. The third, and perhaps most important, point on our map, March 2024. Just 2 months before 3I Atlas reached its perihelion. The scene is the quiet, respectable offices in Geneva. An event takes place that didn't make newspaper headlines. A small subcommittee of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs amends the so-called post-detection policy for discovering extraterrestrial intelligence. This document, unofficially known as the SETI Protocol, had not been changed since 1989. Its essence was simple. In the event of a confirmed contact, the information must be immediately verified and then made public to the global scientific community and the public. The principle of maximum transparency. The new revision, adopted with almost no debate, turned this principle on its head. A new clause, 7.3, was added. It stated that in the event of detecting a signal or object that could pose a potential threat to global stability or technological sovereignty, the initial assessment and decision on further actions are transferred from open scientific institutions to a closed international security commission. Transparency was replaced by classification. Science gave way to politics. The official justification was the need to modernize protocols in line with 21st century challenges. But the timing of this amendment was too suspicious. They were not reacting to a discovery. They were preparing for an arrival. They were building a legal and bureaucratic cage in advance to lock away the knowledge they already anticipated they would soon receive. Now let's superimpose these 3 points: the solar wind anomaly, the global DNS outage, and the quiet change to the SETI protocol, onto our main timeline. The picture ceases to be a collection of coincidences. It acquires a sinister logic. First, a communication channel in the heliosphere was cleared. Then, the global information infrastructure was tested and possibly used under the cover of a glitch. After that, a legal framework for concealing information was created. And only then, when all preparations were complete, did the main actor take the stage, 3I Atlas, which performed its task, sending a signal into the Arctic permafrost, confident that Webb was watching. These are not coincidences. These are the stages of a single, meticulously planned operation. This is choreography. And to understand that this choreography is not being performed for the first time, we need to introduce another element into our story, an artifact from the past. August 15th, 1977. The Big Ear radio telescope at Ohio State University records an anomalous signal coming from the constellation Sagittarius. It lasted for 72 seconds and was so powerful and clear that astronomer Jerry Amon, reviewing the printouts, circled it in red pen and wrote one word in the margin: "Wow." The WOW signal is the holy grail of the SETI program. It has never been repeated. Its source was never found. it has remained the greatest mystery in the history of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But what if that's not the case? Recently, a group of independent amateur astronomers undertook a titanic effort. They took the orbital parameters of 3I Atlas and extrapolated them back in time. They rewound its trajectory for decades, for centuries into the past, to understand where it came from. And the results of their calculations published on the preprint server Archive are staggering. With a high degree of probability, the point in the sky from which 3I Atlas began its journey is in the same tiny patch of the constellation Sagittarius from which the "wow" signal came. This is not proof, but it is a correlation of such strength that it is impossible to ignore. What if the "wow" signal was not an attempt at contact? What if it was an announcement? A warning that a guest was already on its way, sent 47 years before its arrival. What if we are not observing random visits but parts of a single, decades-long mission? All these threads, the anomaly near the sun, the network outage, the protocol amendment, 3I Atlas itself, and its historical connection to the "wow" signal, lead to different agencies. NASA, ICANN, the UN. It seems there is nothing in common between them, but that's not true. There is one organization, one quiet, almost invisible node where all this information converges. It's not the CIA, not the NSA. It's a small, little-known committee at the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs in Vienna, whose name was recently changed. It is now called the Committee for the Assessment of Strategic Interstellar Phenomena. Its meeting minutes are classified. Its membership is not disclosed, but it was this committee that prepared that very amendment to the SETI protocol, and it was to this committee, as leaked memos show, that classified reports were sent from both NASA on the Parker anomaly and from ICANN on the true causes of the global outage. All threads led to one place. This quiet committee, it seems, is the conductor of this entire orchestra of silence. And the most important question now is not, what is happening, but what are they waiting for? And what are they preparing for? When the map of the conspiracy has been drawn, and the threads leading to the conductors have been found, the investigation inevitably confronts the most difficult, most fundamental question. Why? Cui bono? Who benefits? If we assume the existence of a global, multi-level cover-up, we must find a motive. Without a compelling motive, any conspiracy theory, no matter how coherent, remains just a paranoid fantasy. The system is not a comic book villain striving for world domination. It is a complex, inert, bureaucratic mechanism composed of thousands of people, government agencies, scientific institutions, and corporations. To make such a mechanism act in concert, secretly and effectively, requires a reason of incredible, existential importance. The simple desire to hide incompetence or avoid uncomfortable questions is too weak a motive for an operation of this scale. The reason must be commensurate with the crime. And the crime here is the concealment of what might be the most important discovery in human history. Let's consider the potential motives from 3 different angles, from the simplest and most cynical to the most complex and disturbing. The first and most obvious is national security and technological advantage. Imagine for a moment that you are the head of that secret UN commission. Data lands on your desk, an interstellar object of artificial origin, possessing a technology of directed energy transfer capable of interacting with biological systems on a planetary level. This is not just proof of aliens. This is a demonstration of technology that is thousands, if not millions, of years ahead of ours. This is technology that can be used as a weapon capable, for example, of activating dormant viruses, or conversely, of suppressing any biological activity, or influencing the climate, or disabling electronics on an entire continent. The possibilities are endless, and the first to understand the principles of this technology, to replicate it, or at least learn to counteract it, will gain an absolute, undeniable advantage over all other nations. It's the equivalent of obtaining nuclear weapons in 1940. What would you do in such a situation? Immediately disclose the information to the world? Share it with potential adversaries? That would be not just naive. It would be criminal from the perspective of national interest. The first instinct of any power, any state, will not be to share, but to classify, to launch an urgent top-secret program to study the object, to mobilize all scientific and intelligence resources to be the first to solve the puzzle, and for the rest of the world, to create a smokescreen, a convincing cover story about a strange comet and climate change. In this model, the cover-up is not a malicious act against humanity. It is an act of pragmatism. It is the beginning of a new, unprecedented arms race, only this time, the prize is not a missile, but the key to understanding alien technology. There's much to support this version. Historical precedents, for example. When, according to one version, an extraterrestrial craft crashed near Roswell in 1947, the US government's reaction was exactly this: total classification, the creation of a cover story about a weather balloon, and the launch of secret programs to study the debris, which are said to have spurred the development of transistors, fiber optics, and stealth technology. We have seen this script before, and it is perfectly logical from the viewpoint of the psychology of power. But there is a second, deeper, and perhaps more humane motive: the prevention of global panic and social collapse. Let's return to that office in Geneva. The same data lands on your desk, but you look at it not as a military strategist, but as a sociologist or psychologist. What will happen to human civilization if tomorrow, on every screen in the world, irrefutable proof appears that we are not alone? And not just not alone, but that we are being watched. And these observers are capable of interfering with our biosphere as if we were ants in a terrarium? A Brookings Institution study conducted for NASA back in 1960 warned that contact with a superior civilization could lead to the disintegration of all terrestrial cultures and social structures. Religions would collapse. Economies would seize up. Who would pay their mortgage if they arrive tomorrow and give us perpetual energy? Who would obey laws if our governments turn out to be just the chiefs of a native tribe on an island just visited by Captain Cook? A global existential crisis would ensue. Fanatics would declare it the Second Coming or Judgment Day. Anarchists would see it as a chance to destroy the old world. Markets would not just dip by a few percent. They would crash. Chaos, wars, and famine could follow. From this perspective, the cover-up is not a cynical power grab, but an act of supreme responsibility. It's an attempt to protect the fragile fabric of our civilization from a shock it may not survive. It's a decision by a small group of people to bear the burden of this terrible knowledge, to allow the other billions to continue living their lives in peace. They are not hiding the truth to gain an advantage. They are hiding it to protect us from it. This is the concept of the noble lie, known since the time of Plato. And the fact that the cover-up is international in nature supports this version. It's not one country trying to deceive others. It's the coordinated actions of the UN, NASA, ESA, and likely Russian and Chinese agencies. It's as if the world's elites, despite all their conflicts, have reached a consensus on one issue. Humanity is not ready for this truth, and their task is to prepare it. Slowly, gradually, by feeding ideas about interstellar objects and ancient viruses into the culture in measured doses, so that when the time comes, the shock won't be fatal. In this model, the cover-up is not a conspiracy. It is a quarantine. But what's being quarantined is not a virus. It's all of humanity. And it is logical. Perhaps even humane. But there is a third version. The darkest and the most disturbing. What if they are hiding the truth not to win an arms race or to protect us from panic? What if they are hiding it because they already know how it will end, and they are preparing for that finale without us? Let's look at the facts again, but from this, the bleakest angle. An interstellar object activates an ancient bioweapon sleeping on our planet. What is this if not an act of aggression? A quiet, almost imperceptible first strike in a war we don't even know we're in? Now imagine that the system has not only the data we have, but much more. What if they know the nature of this virus? What if they know its purpose? And what if that purpose is not total annihilation, but something more selective? What if this paleovirus, awakened by a signal from space, is a genetic key designed to switch off or reprogram only a certain part of the human population? Or conversely, to activate certain genes only in carriers of some ancient marker? It sounds like science fiction, but CRISPR technology today already allows us to edit the genome with incredible precision. Why do we assume that a civilization capable of interstellar travel hasn't mastered genetics on a level we can't even dream of? In this scenario, the cover-up takes on a completely different meaning. It's not preparation for a war with an external enemy. It's preparation for segregation within our own species. If they know a filter is coming that won't affect everyone, then their primary task is to ensure the survival of the right part of humanity. The elites. Those with the right resources, technologies, or perhaps genetics. And for that, they need time. Time to build isolated, protected shelters. ARCs. To develop vaccines or countermeasures available only to the chosen few. To prepare plans to maintain order when the chaos finally begins. And in this model, all their actions look like parts of a single, monstrous plan. They are not hiding the truth to protect us from panic. They are hiding it to buy time. Time to prepare their own lifeboat while the rest of the Titanic sails towards the iceberg, listening to the soothing music of the official media orchestra. This is no longer a noble lie. This is a betrayal on a planetary scale. And what supports this horrifying version is the silence. The deafening, absolute silence that descends whenever independent researchers get too close to the key questions. The disappearance of sources, sudden technical failures on servers, smear campaigns in the press. This doesn't look like the actions of those trying to protect society. It looks like the actions of those trying to protect their secret. A secret that might be their only chance of survival. And the most terrifying question here is not who benefits, but who already knows they are on the list of the saved. By focusing on the motives for the cover-up, we risk losing sight of the main character in this drama, the object 3I Atlas itself. We have studied its shadow for so long that we have almost forgotten to look at the body. Let's return to it. Let's go back to the crumbs of physical data we have and conduct a detailed, almost forensic analysis, because it is in its structure, its behavior, its anomalous anatomy that the key is hidden, not only to understanding what it is, but also to its true, perhaps horrifying, purpose. Official science, faced with its oddities, chose the path of least resistance. It placed it in the Procrustean bed of existing categories. It's a comet, just a very unusual one. Its non-gravitational acceleration is outgassing just from atypical materials. Its density is a statistical anomaly. But what if that's not true? What if, by trying to force it into the frame of the familiar, we are making the same mistake as the Aztecs, who, upon seeing Cortez's ships, took them for floating mountains? We are trying to describe something utterly alien in the terms of our limited experience. Let us abandon these frames. Let's assume that 3I Atlas is not a comet, that it is an artifact, a machine. And let's consider all its known properties from this new engineering perspective. The first thing any analysis starts with is the trajectory. We already know it was hyperbolic, which proves its interstellar origin, but the devil, as always, is in the details. Specifically, in the eccentricity and inclination of its orbit. The eccentricity of 3I Atlas was about 3.2. This means it was moving extremely fast, much faster than any natural object that could have been ejected from another star system by gravitational forces. To achieve such a speed, the object must have either started from a system with a very massive central star or received an additional acceleration. But the most interesting thing is its orbital inclination. It entered the solar system at an angle of almost 96 degrees to the ecliptic plane, meaning almost perpendicular to the plane in which all the planets orbit. For a natural object, this is extremely unlikely. Most interstellar wanderers, if they exist, should arrive from the plane of the galactic disk. But 3I Atlas came from above, from the galactic north. This was not a random trajectory. It was a targeted trajectory. Imagine a sniper who wants to hit a target on a rotating carousel. He won't shoot in the plane of rotation, where there is a high risk of hitting other horses. He will take a position above the carousel and shoot downwards. The trajectory of 3I Atlas is the perfect engineering solution for entering a planetary system, performing a task near the central star, and leaving, while minimizing gravitational perturbations from the planets and the risk of collision with the asteroid belt. This is not the path of a wanderer. This is the route of a courier. Second, composition and structure. Officially, it's a rocky nucleus rich in refractory metals. But let's use different words. It's an industrial alloy. The presence of osmium and iridium in such concentrations is a direct reference to the strongest and most heat-resistant materials known to our science. These metals are used in the tips of fountain pens, in electrical contacts, in crucibles for growing crystals, anywhere that requires extreme durability and resistance to high temperatures. Now let's remember where 3I Atlas was headed. Into the furnace, into the sun's corona. A natural object of rock and ice on such a trajectory would have been torn apart by gravitational forces and vaporized by the monstrous temperature. But 3I Atlas passed through this hell unharmed. Its structure was designed to withstand it. This is not a rock. It is a hull. Perhaps ablative armor designed to protect something important inside. And what about its density? It was so high that some astrophysicists admitted in private conversations that their models simply break trying to explain it. But if we assume that inside this hull there is not porous rock, but a complex power source, complex equipment, and a control system, then the high average density becomes not an anomaly, but a necessity. This is not a comet. It is a probe, a deeply layered, armored interstellar probe. Third, and most importantly, its behavior. We've already talked about the non-gravitational acceleration. The official version is outgassing. But if it was outgassing, why was it so orderly? Why did the jets turn on and off with a certain periodicity? Let's look at this from an engineering perspective. These are not chaotic emissions. These are course corrections. Maneuvering thrusters. The object wasn't just flying on inertia. It was actively controlling its flight, making microscopic adjustments to its trajectory to arrive at the right point in space at the right time with perfect precision. But the strangest thing about its behavior is what happened at perihelion, at the very moment it supposedly sent its signal. Let's recall Stefan Burns's data, the ejection of microcrystalline dust. Why? What engineering task could this ejection be solving? And here, we enter the realm of the boldest, yet most logical speculation. What if it wasn't just dust? What if it was a swarm of microscopic relays? Imagine, the main probe, at a safe distance, ejects a cloud of micromachines. These machines, using solar light pressure as a sail, briefly form a phased array antenna in space. A giant distributed antenna hundreds of kilometers in size. It is this antenna that allows the energy pulse to be focused into a narrow, precisely aimed beam, capable of penetrating Earth's atmosphere and magnetosphere to reach its target in the permafrost. And after completing the task, these micro-machines made of unstable materials simply disintegrate under solar radiation, leaving almost no trace. This is an elegant, almost brilliant engineering solution, and it explains all the observed facts: the spectral signature of artificial zeolites, the brief dip in brightness, and most importantly, the physical possibility of transmitting a directed signal over such a vast distance. We didn't see outgassing. We saw the probe deploying its main gun turret. So what do we have as a result of our forensic analysis? Before us is not a comet. Before us is an autonomous, high-speed, armored, interstellar probe, equipped with maneuvering thrusters and a weapon system capable of directed energy transfer. It arrived on a targeted trajectory, completed its mission using the sun as a power source for its weapon, and is now leaving on a calculated departure route. This is not a scientific mission. This is a military operation. Quiet, fast, and incredibly effective. And here we come to the most disturbing discovery, hidden in its trajectory after the maneuver near the sun. Its path did not lead away from the system, not in a random direction. Calculations of its new orbit, based on the latest data, show something incredible. Its trajectory does not lead to the stars. It leads to us. Not to Earth itself, of course, but to one of the so-called Lagrange points of the Earth-Moon system. These are unique points in space where the gravitational forces of our planet and its satellite balance each other out. An object placed at such a point can remain stationary relative to the Earth and Moon almost forever, using almost no energy. These are the perfect parking spots in space. And 3i Atlas, it seems, is heading to one of them, to the L2 point, which is located behind the far side of the Moon. It is the ideal observation post. Hidden from our eyes, shielded from terrestrial radio interference, it is not leaving. It is taking up a position. It has completed the first phase of its mission, activation. And now, it is moving on to the second phase, observation. It is waiting, watching as the seeds it has sown begin to sprout. And the most terrifying question that arises from this conclusion is, what exactly is it waiting for? And what will happen when its wait is over? In any detective story, there comes a moment when the accusation has been made, the evidence gathered, the motive determined, and the portrait of the criminal drawn with frightening clarity. It seems the case is closed. In our investigation, we have reached precisely this point. The picture looks complete and terrifying. An artificial probe, disguised as a comet, commits an act of biological warfare and takes up an observation post, preparing for the next stage. This theory explains all the discrepancies, connects all the anomalies, and provides a logical, albeit monstrous answer to the main question. And it is, at this moment, when we are almost convinced of our own correctness, that it is our duty as honest investigators to stop, to take a step back, and to engage the most ruthless, the most ferocious critic, the devil's advocate. We must, for a moment, swing the pendulum of plausibility in the opposite direction and try to destroy our own beautiful, coherent edifice. We are obliged to give the floor to the skeptics, because only the theory that can withstand this storm has the right to exist. So, let's put on the robe of scientific consensus and arm ourselves with Occam's razor, the principle that states the simplest explanation is most likely the correct one. What would a hypothetical professor of astrophysics from Princeton say upon hearing our story? The first thing he would do is dismantle our chain of evidence link by link, showing that each one, taken individually, has a simple, natural, and far more probable explanation. Let's start with the main point, synchronicity. That very peak of microbial activity in Alaska that we consider a detonation. The skeptic would say, "You've fallen into the trap of apophenia. You're seeing a pattern where there is none." He would point out that NOAA's cryosphere monitoring network is imperfect, that many of its stations are old equipment operating in extreme conditions, that failures there are not the exception, but the rule, and that the version of a cascading synchronization failure is not a lie, but the most likely technical explanation. He would cite dozens of other cases in the history of science where seemingly synchronous anomalies turned out to be artifacts of data processing. "You want to see a conspiracy?" he would say, "because it's a more interesting story than a mundane software glitch." Next, he would move on to 3I Atlas. Non-gravitational acceleration? "We still don't fully understand the mechanics of cometary outgassing," he would admit, especially for comets with such an unusual composition, arriving from another star system where the conditions for planet formation could have been completely different. The absence of water ice and the presence of nitrogen is not proof of artificiality. It's simply an indication that it formed in a very cold region of its home system. Its behavior is not an anomaly. It's new data that will force us to revise our models of comet formation. A dense nucleus with heavy metals? A statistical fluctuation, he would shrug. There are billions upon billions of comets in the universe. By the law of large numbers, there must be specimens with extreme characteristics among them. We were just lucky enough to see one. Its trajectory coming from above? Again, a game of chance. Interstellar space is vast, trajectories are random. Any trajectory is possible, and there is no reason to consider one more artificial than another. And what about the missing data from James Webb? Here the skeptic would sigh and say, "You overestimate the reliability of space technology and underestimate the complexity of its operation. Webb is the most complex instrument we have ever launched into space. It is constantly bombarded by cosmic rays. Micrometeoroids have already damaged one of its mirrors. Failures in its systems are not a theoretical possibility, but a statistical inevitability. The loss of 27 minutes of data is unfortunate, but completely plausible from a technical standpoint. The idea that NASA could organize such a clean, traceless cover-up in real time, and then coordinate it with dozens of international partners without a single leak, that is true science fiction. Bureaucracy doesn't work that way." Finally, he would get to our trump card, the data from Stefan Burns, the amateur astronomer. Here, his tone would become particularly condescending. "It's wonderful that enthusiasts contribute to science," he would say, "but we must understand the limits of their capabilities. A ground-based telescope looking through the entire thickness of the atmosphere is a source of a huge amount of noise and artifacts. To detect a hump in a spectrum at the limit of an instrument's sensitivity and pass it off as a discovery, that's a classic example of self-deception, of confirmation bias. He was looking for an anomaly, and he found it in the noise. His data would never pass peer review in a scientific journal. He would remind us that correlation does not imply causation. Yes, all these events happened around the same time, but it could just be a coincidence. A series of incredible, but statistically possible, coincidences. Which explanation is more plausible? He would ask at the end. That we are dealing with a complex but explainable series of natural phenomena and technical failures within the known laws of physics? Or that we have witnessed a secret act of interstellar aggression, concealed by a flawlessly executed global conspiracy, which was accidentally uncovered by a retiree from Austria with a homemade telescope? Apply Occam's razor, and he would be damn convincing. It would seem that's it. Our edifice has collapsed. All our evidence is merely shadows on the wall of Plato's cave. Just a play of imagination, amplified by cognitive biases. We are almost ready to admit defeat and return to the boring but safe official version. An ordinary comet. Unusual coincidences. climate change. End of story. But there was something else. One detail. One fact that no skeptic could explain. A fact that does not depend on interpretation, is not a statistical anomaly, and cannot be written off as a technical failure. A fact that once again, with irresistible force, swings the pendulum of plausibility back in our direction. This fact came from the most unexpected field. Not from astronomy or climatology, but from genetics. When the hype around zombie viruses began, several leading microbiology labs in the world, including the Pasteur Institute in Paris and the Koch Institute in Berlin, received ice samples from Alaska to study the genomes of the awakened paleoviruses. Their goal was to assess the potential threat, to understand how similar these ancient creatures were to modern pathogens. The first results, published in Nature Microbiology, were reassuring. Most of the discovered viruses belong to already known families of giant viruses that infect amoebas. Pithoviruses, mollyviruses. Their genetic code was complex, but entirely terrestrial. They were simply ancient cousins of the microbes that live on the planet today. The world breathed a sigh of relief. But one of the research groups working at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID at Fort Detrick, the very place that holds one of the world's 2 collections of the smallpox virus, went further. They decided to analyze not only the genes themselves, but also the so-called junk DNA, non-coding regions of the genome long considered evolutionary ballast. And in one of the samples, belonging to a previously unknown type of virus they tentatively named Pandoravirus eximius, they found something that should not exist in nature. Inside a long, seemingly meaningless sequence of nucleotides, they discovered a perfectly structured, repeating block of code. It was not built on the 4 standard letters of the genetic alphabet: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. Its structure contained a 5th, artificially synthesized base pair, which scientists on Earth had only learned to create in the last few years as part of xenobiology research. This alone was a shock. But the most important thing was the structure of this block. It did not code for any protein. It worked like a binary switch, a complex molecular machine consisting of 2 parts. The first part was a resonator, a section of DNA twisted into a very specific 3-dimensional structure that was inert under normal conditions, but entered a state of strong vibrational resonance when exposed to an electromagnetic field of a strictly defined, very low frequency. And the second part was a lock. As long as the resonator was calm, it held the lock in a closed state, blocking the expression of neighboring genes, the very ones responsible for the virus's replication. But as soon as the resonator began to vibrate under the influence of an external signal, its vibrations physically broke the protein structure of the lock. The lock opened, and the genes responsible for the virus's reproduction were switched on. This was not the product of random mutation. This was elegant, flawless nanotechnology, a sleeper agent that had remained inert for millennia, waiting for a single, specific key signal to activate it. And the frequency of this signal, calculated based on the structure of the DNA resonator, was around 3 kilohertz. The exact same frequency that the Aachen Group's magnetometers recorded in the Yukon 3 minutes before the microbial explosion. This was the smoking gun. Irrefutable, physical proof linking the signal from space to the awakening of the virus at a molecular level. This knowledge was so explosive that the Fort Detrick Group's report was never published. It was immediately classified. But not before one of its authors, realizing the scale of the discovery, managed to leak it to an anonymous source. And now, we have it. And it shatters all the skeptics' arguments. Because this is no longer a correlation. It is a cause and effect relationship. The discovery from the Fort Detrick Group, the genetic lock tuned to the frequency of 3i Atlas's signal, moves our investigation from the realm of speculation and circumstantial evidence into the world of cold, irrefutable physics and biochemistry. But with it, it presents us with a new, even deeper, and more disturbing question. If the activation technology is so complex and alien, then who created it, and how long ago? To answer this question, we must expand the context of our investigation even further. We must look at the mystery of 3i Atlas not as a unique event, but as a link in a chain that stretches back not decades, but millennia. And at the same time, we must look into the very near future, at the horizon of our own technological capabilities. Because the line between their technology and ours is becoming increasingly blurred. And this blurring of lines is perhaps the most frightening aspect of this entire story. Let's start with the technological context. Until recently, the idea of directed energy transfer capable of influencing biological objects at a distance seemed like pure science fiction. But today, that is no longer the case. We ourselves are on the cusp of this era. Projects like SpaceX's Starlink are not just satellite internet. They are the first ever global network of thousands of small, interconnected satellites capable of forming phased array antennas in space. Today, they are used to transmit data. But tomorrow, the same swarm of satellites, with minor modifications, could be used to focus energy, microwave, laser, on any point on the planet's surface. The military is already developing space-based solar power stations, which are essentially the same thing: systems for wirelessly transmitting energy from orbit to Earth, officially to power remote bases, unofficially as a potential weapon. We are already designing what we presume 3i Atlas used, or take another field, synthetic biology. The idea of creating a genetic code with artificial base pairs, the very fifth element found in the Arctic virus, was theoretical a decade ago. Today, it is a reality. Scientists at the Scripps Research Institute have already created a strain of E. coli, whose genome contains 2 additional artificial letters. We are learning to write in the language of life, adding new symbols to its alphabet. And what is CRISPR technology if not the very molecular lock capable of turning genes on and off at our command? We currently use chemical signals to activate it, but research in optogenetics already allows us to control genes with light. The next step is control via radio waves or magnetic fields. We ourselves, right now, in our laboratories, are creating primitive analogs of the very mechanism that was embedded in Pandora virus eximius hundreds of thousands of years ago. And this is where a dizzying question arises. If we, a civilization that has been using electricity for less than 200 years, are already on the threshold of such technologies, why are we so certain that another, more ancient civilization could not have mastered them millions of years ago? Our own rapid technological development is the strongest argument that the capabilities of 3i Atlas are not supernatural. They are simply the next logical step in the evolution of technology. And this leads us to a frightening thought. We tend to think of contact as an encounter with something utterly incomprehensible. But what if we meet not gods, but simply older and more experienced engineers? What if their technologies are not magic, but simply physics and biology taken to their logical extremes? And what if the gap between us is not so vast? Perhaps we are not natives meeting Captain Cook. Perhaps we are simply 17th century engineers seeing the blueprints for a steam engine for the first time. We may not understand all the intricacies, but we recognize familiar principles. And this recognition is the most terrifying part, because it means we can understand not only their technologies, but also their motives. And they might turn out to be painfully human. Control, survival, expansion. This idea of technological convergence forces us to re-examine the very concept of artificial. We are used to searching for SETI-style radio signals or giant Dyson spheres in space. But this is too anthropocentric a view. It's like expecting ancient Romans to build skyscrapers. Any sufficiently advanced civilization would likely transition from macro-engineering to nano-engineering. Why build giant ships when you can send a swarm of self-replicating probes the size of a dust mote? Why shout into the radio when you can write your message directly into the genome of living organisms on the target planet, creating a biological archive that will last forever? Perhaps we are looking in the wrong place and for the wrong thing. Perhaps the entire biosphere of Earth is a giant message, a library, or maybe even a minefield waiting for its time. And objects like Oumuamua and 3i Atlas are not ships. They are keys, librarians, or bomb disposal experts. They don't come to talk to us. They come to service their equipment, which was installed here long before the appearance of humans. And here we must ask the main question. Who was the installer? If the virus lay dormant in the permafrost for, by some estimates, up to 700,000 years, it means the operation to plant it occurred in the Middle Pleistocene. At that time, our ancestors, Homo heidelbergensis, were just learning to make primitive stone tools. The planet was different. Ice ages alternated with interglacial periods. Who could have carried out such a complex bioengineering operation on a wild, primitive Earth? And why? The answer may be hidden in the so-called ancient astronaut hypothesis, which official science has always considered fringe. But what if it's not so crazy? What if Earth, in its long history, was not just a cradle of life, but a testing ground, a laboratory, or even a colony for someone else? And the traces of this presence should be sought not in the pyramids, but in the anomalies of the geological and paleontological record. Sudden mass extinctions that don't fit climate models. The appearance of new species that looks not like gradual evolution, but like a leap and introduction. Let's consider just one example. The Great Permian Extinction, which occurred 252 million years ago. The most terrible catastrophe in the history of life on Earth, wiping out 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial ones. The official cause is massive eruptions of the Siberian traps, which caused a greenhouse effect and ocean acidification. But there are many white spots in this theory. The extinction was too fast, too total. And recently, geologists discovered anomalous concentrations of nickel and fullerenes, carbon molecules that could only have formed under extreme conditions, in rocks from that period. What if the eruptions were not the cause, but the consequence? What if they were triggered by the impact of a giant asteroid, or even worse, the use of some kind of geological weapon? What if someone sterilized the planet to clear it for a new evolutionary experiment? And the virus activated by 3i Atlas is just a remnant of that ancient technology, a dormant mechanism designed for the fine-tuning of the biosphere or for eliminating undesirable experimental results. In this context, we, humanity, are not the pinnacle of creation. We are just one of those results, and perhaps our experiment is coming to an end, and someone has sent an auditor to tally the results. We are learning to create illusions in the sky with swarms of satellites. But what if someone has long been using them against us, and we don't even notice, mistaking them for comets? And what if our own technological revolution is not our achievement, but simply the awakening of dormant knowledge embedded in our own DNA? Questions for which we have no answers yet. But their very existence changes everything. When an investigation reaches technological and historical depths, it inevitably ascends to the next, final level, the existential level. We can no longer speak merely of viruses, probes, and conspiracy theories. We are forced to speak of meaning, of our place in the universe. Because every link in our chain of evidence, from the solar wind anomaly to the genetic lock in the Siberian DNA, resonates with the most fundamental questions humanity has asked itself since it first looked up at the stars. What does it all mean? If we are not alone, Then who are we? And what is this ringing, infinite, great silence of the cosmos that has surrounded us all this time? Was it proof of our solitude? Or on the contrary, proof of something far more complex and frightening? Let's start with the most famous of these questions, the Fermi paradox. In 1950, physicist Enrico Fermi asked his colleagues a simple question over lunch. If the universe is so old and so vast, and if the probability of life arising on other planets is not zero, then where is everybody? Why do we see no clear signs of the activities of other civilizations? No giant astro-engineering structures, no bustling interstellar traffic, not even a simple radio signal saying, "We are here." This paradox has generated dozens of hypothetical answers. Perhaps we are truly alone. The rare Earth hypothesis. Perhaps intelligent life is extremely rare. Perhaps all civilizations inevitably destroy themselves before they can venture into space. The great filter hypothesis. Or maybe they are just too far away, and we will never meet. But the story of Three-Eye Atlas offers us a completely different, much darker answer. This answer is known as the dark forest hypothesis, popularized by the Chinese science fiction author Cixin Liu, but with roots in the work of cosmologist David Brin. Its essence is simple and terrifying. The universe is a dark forest. Every civilization is a hunter with a rifle, stalking through the trees. He cannot see the other hunters. The only way for him to survive is to maintain absolute silence. Because if he reveals his presence, lights a fire or shouts, he immediately exposes his location to everyone else. And he doesn't know who the others are, friends or foes. But in a situation of total distrust and competition for limited resources, any other civilization is a potential threat. Therefore, the safest action upon detecting someone else is not to say hello, but to shoot first. A preemptive strike, just in case. In this model, the great silence of the cosmos is not the absence of life. It is a sign of intelligence. Everyone is silent because everyone is afraid. And only fools, like us, who have been shouting into the radio across the galaxy for a century, are giving away their position. In light of this hypothesis, the behavior of Three-Eye Atlas ceases to be an act of unprovoked aggression. It becomes logical, almost predictable. They are an ancient, cautious hunter civilization. They detected our noise, our radio broadcasts, our nuclear explosions. They realized that a new, noisy, and potentially dangerous species had emerged on the third planet from this yellow dwarf. What do? They don't fly here in giant ships with blasters. That's too loud, too risky. They send a quiet, small, disguised probe. A stealth mission. This probe doesn't carry a weapon. It simply activates what is already in place. A biological filter, perhaps laid down millions of years ago, as part of some ancient terraforming or planetary defense program. The goal is not to destroy us in a fiery apocalypse, but to quietly, elegantly edit the biosphere, to eliminate the threat before it grows. This is not war. It is pest control. Cold, impersonal, and incredibly effective. In this worldview, we are not the victims of evil aliens. We are just a noisy animal that has wandered into someone else's hunting ground and is now being quietly put to sleep so it doesn't scare away the game. And the silence that follows will not be a sign of our death, but a sign of order being restored. The great silence is not emptiness. It is discipline. But there is another, equally profound concept that might explain what is happening. The idea of von Neumann probes, or in its softer form, Bracewell probes. Unlike the predatory dark forest model, this hypothesis suggests that advanced civilizations might explore the galaxy not in person, but with self-replicating automated probes. Such a probe, arriving in a star system, finds resources, for example, in the asteroid belt, builds copies of itself, and sends them to the next stars. This allows for a galactic census to be conducted in a few million years, a negligible time on a cosmic scale. Bracewell probes are a subtype of such machines, designed not just for exploration, but for passive contact. Such a probe arrives in a system with potentially intelligent life and enters a dormant mode. It does not interfere. It just waits. For tens, hundreds of thousands of years. It waits until the local civilization itself reaches a certain technological level. For example, until it invents radio or goes into space. And only then, upon receiving this trigger, does the probe activate and initiate a dialogue. What if 3i Atlas and Oumuamua are exactly such probes? What if they are part of an ancient dormant network that surrounds us? But their activation is not the beginning of a friendly dialogue. Our technological noise has become a signal for them not to talk, but to launch a certain protocol. And this protocol is not a greeting, but a test, an exam. Imagine a gardener civilization that sowed the seeds of life throughout the galaxy millions of years ago. And now, from time to time, it sends its automated gardeners to check on what has grown. Is this new intelligent species worthy of being accepted into the galactic community? Or is it an aggressive, dangerous weed that needs to be pulled before it infects the entire garden? The activation of an ancient virus in this scenario is not an attack. It is a stress test. How will our civilization react to a global, but not entirely lethal, pandemic? Can we unite, show solidarity, find a scientific solution? Or will we descend into chaos, resource wars, conspiracy theories, and mutual recriminations? Perhaps 3i Atlas, now taking up its position on the far side of the moon, is not just waiting. It is collecting data. It is listening to our telecommunications, analyzing our social media, tracking our political decisions. It is giving us a grade, and our future depends on that grade. Will the next probe bring an invitation, or will it bring herbicides? Both of these hypotheses, the dark forest and the galactic exam, change our perception of reality. They transform a passive, empty universe into an active environment, full of hidden meanings and dangers. They force us to recognize the fragility of our civilization. We built our world on the confidence that we are the masters of this planet, that the laws of physics are immutable, and that the future is in our hands. But what if this is all an illusion? What if we are living in a rented house, and the real landlord can return at any moment and evict us if we break the rules of residence? Rules we didn't even know existed. This feeling of existential dread, of vertigo from the realization of our own insignificance in the face of the incomprehensible. This is the main consequence of our investigation. It's not just a fear of aliens. It's a fear of a reality that has turned out to be infinitely more complex and dangerous than we thought. We looked at the stars and saw beauty and inspiration. But what if, all this time, we were looking down the barrels of unloaded guns, and one of them just clicked? Perhaps the silence of space is not the absence of life. Perhaps it is a sign of respect that the survivors pay to the dead. Or maybe it's the silence of an exam hall, where everyone is writing their own test, and whoever cheats or makes noise will be expelled. We do not know which of these models is correct, but the very fact that we are forced to seriously consider them means that humanity's childhood has ended. We have left the cradle, and we have discovered that beyond it lies not a magical garden, but a dark forest. And now, we will have to learn its laws very quickly. And the first law is, listen to the silence, because it holds more information than any scream. Philosophical abysses and existential dread are the environment where true understanding is born, but they cannot be the endpoint of an investigation. For knowledge not to turn into paralyzing terror, it must become a tool. It must be directed towards the future. From the world of hypotheses, we must return to the world of concrete, tangible events, because it is there, on the timeline of the next few years, that the next act of this drama will unfold. And we have a unique opportunity not just to watch it, but to understand what is really happening behind the scenes of official press releases. Our investigation has revealed a hidden pattern in the past. Now our task is to use this pattern to predict the future. The moment of truth is coming, and it has a specific date, a name, and a purpose. And that name is the Hera mission. Officially, Hera is a European Space Agency mission, part of humanity's first ever planetary defense program. Its predecessor, the American DART probe, successfully completed its kinetic mission in 2022. It crashed into the asteroid Dimorphos, a moonlet of the larger asteroid Didymos, and changed its orbit. It was a brilliant demonstration that we are, in principle, capable of deflecting an asteroid threatening Earth. Now it's Hera's turn. Its launch is scheduled for October 2024. 2 years later, in late 2026, it will arrive at the Didymos Dimorphos system to conduct a detailed crime scene investigation. It will study the crater left by DART, precisely measure Dimorphos's mass, and analyze the change in its orbit. The mission's goal is noble and clear: to gather data that will allow us to turn the crude kinetic impact method into a psi-precision technology for protecting our planet. All of this sounds like an inspiring story of humanity learning to defend its home. But, as we now know, the most important stories are the ones not told aloud. Let's look at the Hera mission through the lens of our investigation. And the first thing that stands out is its technological equipment. Hera is not just a camera on wheels. It is a highly sophisticated analytical suite. On board is a LiDAR for high-precision surface mapping, a thermal imager to study the asteroid's thermal properties, and, most importantly for us, a multispectral camera called the Asteroid Framing Camera, or AFC. This camera can see in ranges invisible to the human eye, including the very near-infrared spectrum where Stefan Burns detected the anomaly with 3-eye Atlas. But that's not all. Hera carries 2 tiny CubeSats. One of them, Juventus, is equipped with a low-frequency radar capable of seeing through the asteroid to study its internal structure. The other, Milani, carries a hyperspectrometer capable of analyzing the surface's mineral composition with incredible precision. This is the perfect set of tools not just to look at a crater. This is the perfect set of tools to conduct a detailed search and analysis of an extraterrestrial artifact. Now let's look at the mission's target, the asteroid Didymos and its moonlet Dimorphos. Why them? The official answer: because it's a binary system which allows for a very precise measurement of the change in orbit of one body around another. But there are thousands of binary asteroids in the solar system. Why was this one chosen? And here we encounter the first oddity. Didymos is a so-called S-type asteroid. This means it is mostly composed of silicates and metals like iron and nickel. But its density, measured by radar observations from Earth, is abnormally low. It's almost half as dense as ordinary rock. The official explanation: it's a rubble pile, a loose collection of rocks held together by weak gravity. But what if that's not the case? What if its low average density is because it's partially hollow inside? Or because its structure contains not just rock, but something else? For instance, ice. But for an S-type asteroid orbiting so close to the Sun, the presence of ice is nonsensical. It would have vaporized long ago. Unless that ice is protected by something, like a durable refractory shell. And this is where all the threads begin to converge. Let's form a hypothesis. What if Didymos is not just an asteroid? What if it's another sleeper? An ancient interstellar probe, similar to 3-eye Atlas, that arrived in our system thousands or millions of years ago and settled into a stable orbit in the asteroid belt, disguised as an ordinary rock. What if DART was sent to it not to test a defense system, What if its mission was a dissection? Imagine, DART's kinetic impact is not an attack. It's a surgical incision. It was delivered not to move the asteroid, but to breach its outer, rocky shell and expose what's inside. And now, Hera is flying there, not as an investigator. It's flying as a pathologist. With its instruments, it will peer inside that incision, study the internal structure, analyze the chemical composition of the object's guts. It is not looking for signs of a collision. It is looking for signs of technology. In this light, the entire planetary defense program, AIDA, asteroid impact and deflection assessment, of which DART and Hera are parts, ceases to be just a scientific experiment. It becomes a cover operation. A perfect, brilliantly simple operation. The system couldn't just send a mission to a suspicious asteroid. That would raise too many questions. Instead, they created a noble, universally understood goal: the defense of Earth. They staged an entire spectacle of attacking an asteroid that posed no threat anyway. And now they are sending an investigative mission to study the results. It's a flawless legend. And it allows them, right under the world's nose, to conduct the first ever mission to study a potential extraterrestrial artifact up close. What does this mean for us? It means the countdown has already begun. Late 2026 to early 2027. That is the time window when Hera will arrive at its target and begin transmitting data. This will be the next moment of truth. Of course, we won't see live footage of an alien ship. All critically important information will be immediately classified. But we will be able to watch for indirect signs. We will watch for the silence. Will there be technical glitches again? Delays in data publication? Will strange, out-of-context articles about the unique mineralogical features of Dimorphos appear in scientific journals? Any deviation from protocol, any anomaly in the information flow from the mission will be a signal to us. A signal that they have found something. And there is one more, most alarming aspect to this story. Let's remember where 3i Atlas is now. It has taken up an observation post at the L2 Lagrange point, behind the moon. It is waiting. Now let's see what happens when Hera begins its investigation of Didymos. For the first time in its history, humanity is not just passively observing a potential artifact, but actively interfering. We have breached it. We are about to go inside with our instruments. How will the observer react to this? Will it perceive it as an act of exploration? Or as an act of aggression? A desecration? What if our attempt to dissect one of their sleeper probes becomes the very trigger that causes 3i Atlas to shift from passive observation to active measures? What if the Hera mission, officially designed to protect the planet, actually becomes the event that provokes the real threat? We are flying to Didymos to solve a mystery, but we risk, without knowing it, pulling the trigger of a much more terrifying mechanism. And the most frightening thing is that those who planned this mission, that same secret UN commission, most likely know about this risk, and they are taking it anyway. This means the stakes in this game are so high that they are willing to risk everything. They are willing to risk direct contact, perhaps even conflict, for the knowledge hidden inside that dim asteroid. And all we can do is wait and watch how the most dangerous archaeological expedition in human history will end. In the grand drama of cosmic conspiracies and interstellar artifacts, it's very easy to forget that history is not made by impersonal systems or mysterious observers. It is made by people. Real people of flesh and blood who sit at their telescopes at night, who sift through gigabytes of data for hours, who risk their careers and reputations to ask an inconvenient question. Our investigation would have been impossible without these people, without the seekers who form the decentralized global nervous system of citizen science. They are the true heroes of this story. And to understand the full depth and drama of this information war, We must for a moment shift our focus from the cold stars to these individuals, to the Davids who dared to challenge the Goliath of institutional silence. Let's return to Stefan Burns, the retired optical engineer from the Austrian Alps. His discovery was the turning point in our investigation. But what happened to him after he published his data on a private forum? At first, there was a wave of admiration from other enthusiasts. His work became a sensation in the small circles of independent researchers. His data was downloaded thousands of times, analyzed, double-checked, and no one could find a flaw. But then, something else began. The pressure started. At first, it was gentle, almost imperceptible. On the same forum where he was praised, several new accounts with very professional-sounding usernames suddenly appeared. These experts began to methodically, point by point, dissect his methodology. They didn't insult him. They did worse. With polite, lethal meticulousness, they pointed out potential sources of error, the possibility of incorrect calibration of his homemade spectrograph, the influence of high-altitude turbulence that he had supposedly not accounted for. Their arguments were so technically complex and scientific-sounding that most forum participants simply couldn't refute them. They weren't trying to prove Burns wrong. They were trying to sow doubt, to create information noise in which his discovery would simply drown. This is a classic discrediting tactic, well known to intelligence agencies. Don't refute, dilute. Stefan, being an experienced engineer, tried to respond. He published his calibration files, provided calculations, proving he had accounted for all possible interferences. But it was like fighting a hydra. For every answer he gave, 3 new, more sophisticated questions appeared. The atmosphere on the forum changed. From a space of excitement, it turned into a courtroom where Burns was the sole defendant. Then the pressure escalated. He received an email to his personal account. It was sent from an address supposedly belonging to the legal department of a major European aerospace corporation. In the letter, he was politely but firmly warned that some components of his homemade spectrograph might be infringing on their patents. He was advised to refrain from further publication of data obtained with this counterfeit equipment to avoid litigation. It was a pure bluff. No one was going to sue him. The goal was different: to intimidate, to silence him. For an elderly man living on a modest pension, the threat of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit from a multinational corporation is a powerful psychological blow. But that's not all. The final chord in this campaign to neutralize the Oracle was the most cynical. One night, his small home observatory was vandalized. Someone smashed several panels of the sliding roof and filled the optical axis of his telescope with expanding foam. The police who responded to the call wrote it off as local teenage hooligans. But Stefan knew it wasn't. The vandals hadn't touched anything else in his house. They didn't steal his expensive computer or tools. Their only target was the telescope, the very eye that saw what it shouldn't have seen. This was not vandalism. It was a message, direct and unequivocal. Don't look there. Stefan Burns didn't break. He fixed the roof and is now trying to restore his unique instrument. But he no longer publishes anything. He has gone into the shadows. The system couldn't disprove his data, but it managed to silence its source. Or take another story. The story of that anonymous source from the Fort Detrick lab who leaked us the report on the genetic lock. We will never know his real name. In our correspondence through encrypted channels, he called himself Prometheus. He was a young scientist, one of the authors of that sensational discovery. And judging by his messages, he went through a torturous internal struggle. On one hand, he had signed a non-disclosure agreement for classified information. He understood that his discovery had strategic importance. But on the other hand, he was a scientist. He believed that knowledge of this magnitude could not be the property of one government or one secret service. It belongs to all of humanity. He watched as his senior colleagues, following orders from above, obediently shelved the report. How they began to develop alternative interpretations of the data to create an official, safe version for publication. And he realized that if he didn't act, the truth would die before it was ever born. His decision to leak the report was an act of incredible courage. He was risking more than just his career. In a country where disclosing state secrets can land you in prison for decades, he was risking his freedom and possibly his life. The last message we received from Prometheus came a few days after we confirmed receipt of the file. It was short. They suspect something wiping all contacts. Good luck. After that, he went silent. Forever. We don't know what happened to him. Was he arrested? Or did he just go to ground, deleting all traces of his digital existence? We can only hope he is safe. But his story is a tragic reminder of the price that is sometimes paid for the truth. He, like his mythological namesake, stole fire from the gods to give it to humanity, and he was most likely punished severely for it. These two stories, of Stephen Burns and Prometheus, are not just isolated cases. They are illustrations of a systemic approach. The system fights dissent not with tanks and armies. Its weapons are far more subtle and effective. They are information noise, legal pressure, psychological intimidation, and, in extreme cases, targeted physical actions disguised as everyday incidents. It does not create martyrs. It creates outcasts, madmen, bankrupts. It isolates the sources of truth, cutting them off from society until they silence themselves. But it is in this very tactic that its greatest weakness lies. It can silence one person, but it cannot silence everyone. And the work of these seekers, their sacrifices, are not in vain. Burns' data, though he has gone quiet, continues to live on the internet, analyzed and used by others. The report from Prometheus is now in our hands, and we are making it public. The system may win individual battles, but it is losing the war. Because truth, once released, has the properties of a virus. It cannot be forced back into the test tube. It spreads, it mutates, it finds new hosts. And every time the system tries to plug one leak, it only increases the pressure in the boiler, bringing the moment of explosion closer. The work of these people, these invisible heroes, has not gone unnoticed. And soon after publishing their findings, they faced not only technical difficulties, but real, tangible threats that only confirmed they were on the right path. In every complex investigation, there comes a point when the circle closes. When, after a long journey through a labyrinth of circumstantial evidence, anomalies, and theories, you return to the very first point, to the initial event. But you see it with completely different eyes. What at first seems simple and clear now, in light of everything we've learned, acquires a new, frightening depth. We began our story with two seemingly unrelated events: the strange, synchronous awakening of ancient viruses in the Arctic and the flyby of the anomalous comet 3I Atlas. The official version called the first a consequence of global warming, and the second an astronomical curiosity. We proposed that these were not two events, but one, that it was a targeted activation. And only now, having gone through all the stages of our investigation, through the data gaps, the testimonies of the oracles, the anatomy of the probe itself, and the genetic structure of the virus, can we return to the beginning and understand just how complex and multi-layered this operation truly was. And only now do we begin to realize that what we took for the main event was just a smokescreen for something far more important. Let's look again, but with new knowledge, at what happened on May 12th, 2024. We thought the main goal of the 3I Atlas operation was to activate Pandora virus eximius and possibly other similar paleoviruses. The 3 kilohertz signal was the key, and the genetic lock in the virus's DNA was the lock. It's logical. But this logic doesn't answer one very important question. Why? Why such a complex mechanism? If some ancient civilization wanted to plant a biological time bomb in our biosphere, why did it choose such an exotic and complicated method of detonation? A directed energy beam from space is an incredibly complex technology. It would have been much simpler to tie the virus's activation to some natural terrestrial trigger. For example, to reaching a certain average global temperature, or a specific concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or even the solar cycle. That would be reliable, simple, and wouldn't require sending special activator probes every few thousand years. The complexity of an activation mechanism always indicates that it has an additional, hidden function. And this is where we must recall that timestamp synchronization error in NOAA's cryosphere monitoring network. The official version claimed it was a cascading failure that created the illusion of a peak. We demolished that version, proving such a failure was technically impossible. We assumed it was a lie, a cover-up. But what if it wasn't entirely a lie? What if there really was a failure? But it wasn't the cause of the illusion, but a side effect of the main event? Let's consider this idea. What is a monitoring network? It's hundreds of autonomous stations, each of which is essentially a small robot with a set of sensors and a communication system. What would happen to such complex electronics if they were hit by a powerful, focused pulse at a frequency of 3 kilohertz? Extremely low frequencies have high penetrating power and can induce so-called stray currents in electronic circuits. They can cause processor glitches, damage memory modules, and, most importantly, disrupt the operation of time synchronization systems, which are very sensitive to any electromagnetic interference. And here, the picture begins to form a completely new pattern. What if the main purpose of the signal sent by 3i Atlas was not to activate viruses? What if activating viruses was only a secondary objective, a cover? What if the primary target was the sensor network itself? Imagine, the observers know that we are building a nervous system of sensors across the planet. We are learning to see, hear, and feel our planet in real time. We are becoming more transparent to them. What do? They launch a preemptive strike. They send a signal that has a dual purpose. On a physical level, it activates a biological agent, creating chaos and diverting our attention to the problem of a pandemic. And on an information level, it strikes at our very ability to observe. It blinds our sensory network in a key region, creating a failure that we then write off as a technical error ourselves. It's brilliant. They didn't just activate a virus. They simultaneously discredited the very system that could have detected that activation. They made us doubt the readings of our own instruments. They hacked not just a virus. They hacked our trust in data. They turned our strength, our ability to monitor, into our weakness. In this new light, the Trickster event is not just the awakening of viruses. It's the entire situation, including the failure itself. The chaos they created was not biological, but informational. They threw us bait, a story about zombie viruses and global warming, and we, as planned, swallowed it. All our resources, all our best minds, virologists, climatologists, epidemiologists, rushed to study this problem. We started arguing about emission quotas, new vaccines, melting ice. We were looking at microbes and thermometers, but we stopped looking at the sky. We stopped asking the question, could this natural process have been initiated by someone? The operation was perfect. They didn't just cover their tracks. They made us trample over them ourselves while we were busy digging into the problem they handed us. And here we arrive at the final, most shocking revelation. The detail that connects all the threads and calls into question the very nature of our reality. Let's recall the signal again. A frequency of 3 kilohertz. Why that specific frequency? We assumed it was chosen because the resonator in the virus's DNA is tuned to it. But what if the cause and effect relationship is reversed? What if the resonator in the DNA was tuned to this frequency because it has a much more fundamental universal significance? 3 kilohertz is a frequency from the very low frequency, VLF, radio band. In Earth's natural environment, such waves are generated, for example, during powerful lightning discharges. But there is another, much more interesting source, the Schumann resonances. Our planet and its ionosphere form a giant spherical resonator cavity. Electromagnetic waves born from lightning are trapped in this cavity and begin to oscillate at specific harmonic frequencies. The fundamental frequency is 7.83 hertz, but there are higher harmonics, including in the range of several kilohertz. These waves are the natural background pulse of our planet, its electromagnetic heartbeat. Now imagine, what if the genetic lock in the virus is tuned not to an artificial signal from space, but to one of the harmonics of this natural planetary pulse? Then, no probe would be needed for its activation. It should have switched on by itself once the conditions on the planet became right. But what then did 3i Atlas do? It didn't bring the key. It forged it. It simulated, artificially generated, and amplified to an incredible power the very natural signal that was supposed to serve as the trigger. Why? To start the process ahead of schedule? To perform the activation not when it was planned by the natural course of events, but when it needed it to happen. This changes the picture completely. We are not just dealing with a planted mine. We are dealing with the hacking of someone else's system. As if there are two forces, two ancient civilizations, playing their game on the field of our planet. One of them, the proverbial sours, laid down a long-term biological mechanism here, tied to natural planetary cycles. And the second, the hackers, to whom 3i Atlas apparently belongs, came to hijack control, to activate this mechanism for their own interests. And here it is, the final revelation, the failure of Noe's cryosphere monitoring network was not just a cover. It was a cover for a cover. They created informational chaos around the awakening of the viruses so we wouldn't realize that something far more important had actually happened. Not just an activation, but an act of sabotage, an act of interference in someone else's much older and larger plan. What we took for the first shot in a war against us might actually be just one battle in an ancient, invisible war between two extraterrestrial powers, taking place right here, under our noses. And we are not the players in this war. We are not even the pieces on the board. We are the board itself. And the most terrifying thing about this knowledge is the realization that we don't know the rules. We don't know who is on our side. We don't know whose victory would be the lesser evil for us. We are not just in a state of ignorance. We are in a double blind spot, where both our digital and our cosmic sensors have gone dark simultaneously, and reality as we understood it is falling apart. When an investigation reaches its peak, when the last, most shocking detail falls into place, a silence follows. Not the silence that reigns in space or in the Arctic ice, but an internal silence, a deafening silence of realization. It is not followed by the joy of victory, nor the relief of a solved mystery. It is followed only by a cold, heavy weight, the weight of knowledge that can neither be forgotten nor shared with a world that continues to live in blissful ignorance. This is what philosophers call tragic knowledge. Not just information, but a burden that forever separates the one who knows from those who do not. And you and I, having walked this path to the end, now carry this burden together. We see the threads. We see the choreography. We see a ghostly war between two incomprehensible forces unfolding on our planet as if on a chessboard. We have understood that the awakening of the viruses is not the cause, but a consequence. That the failure of the sensor network was not a mistake, but a tactic. That 3-Eye Atlas is not an aggressor, but a hacker, a saboteur who interfered in someone else's, even more ancient plan. We have assembled all the pieces of the puzzle. And now, we see the picture. A picture so vast, so alien to the human scale, that its very contemplation induces vertigo. But what are we to do with this picture? What happens when a small group of independent seekers, armed with only curiosity and laptops, gains access to knowledge capable of turning the world upside down? The answer is simple and tragic. Nothing. The world goes on. In the morning, people drink their coffee, read news about political scandals and currency rates. Televisions tell them about the need to fight climate change to prevent the awakening of new zombie viruses. Scientists in respectable institutions publish hundreds of papers on the unusual properties of interstellar comets. The World Health Organization develops new pandemic preparedness protocols. The wheels of the system keep turning, producing a soothing, familiar noise. And in this noise, our voice, the voice of those who shout, "You're looking in the wrong direction. The problem isn't the climate or the comet, but a war of gods above your heads," sounds like the ravings of a madman. They don't hear us. And those who do hear don't believe. And those who do believe are afraid. Because our knowledge is toxic. It destroys foundations. It cancels out all familiar meanings. If our existence is merely a side effect of someone else's experiment, then what is the point of our wars, our religions, our arts? If our future depends not on our decisions, but on which of two unknown forces wins their stellar game, then why do anything at all? This knowledge does not liberate. It paralyzes. It creates a sense of existential isolation, of alienation from the rest of humanity. You walk down the street, see people rushing about their business, and realize you are living in a different reality from them. Their world is one of mortgages, elections, and football games. Your world is one of genetic locks, saboteur probes, and an invisible war. Between these worlds lies a chasm, and you stand on the edge of this chasm, utterly alone. This is precisely what is happening to those who were the source of our knowledge. Stefan Burns, the Austrian oracle, has fixed his telescope. But he no longer looks at interstellar objects. He has switched to studying variable stars. Safe, classic astronomy. He has found his own way to forget, to retreat back into a world where stars are just beautiful lights, not the eyes of observers. Prometheus, our source from Fort Detrick, never made contact again. He vanished, dissolved. Perhaps he is alive and well, but forced to wear the mask of an ordinary person for the rest of his days, hiding within him knowledge that could burn the world. He has become a living ghost, a keeper of a secret he can share with no one. We, as storytellers, as investigators, feel this isolation too. We gather these fragments, assemble them into a narrative, but who can we tell it to? Official science will never accept our conclusions, because they are built on anonymous sources and circumstantial evidence. Governments will never confirm them, because this knowledge would destroy their monopoly on power. And the general public, they are simply not ready. This is the ultimate victory of the system. It won not when it classified a report or intimidated a witness. It won the moment it created a world in which the very possibility of such a truth existing seems absurd. It has built a mental cage so strong, made of common sense, scientific consensus, and verified facts, that any information that does not fit into this cage is automatically declared nonsense, conspiracy theory, fantasy. Our mouths don't need to be gagged. We can shout from the rooftops, but no one will hear us through the thick walls of this cage. We possess absolute knowledge, yet we are absolutely powerless to change anything. We see the threads, we see the choreography, but the puppeteers remain in the shadows, and the world continues to dance to their music, unaware that it is dancing on the edge of a precipice. And in this lies our tragic burden. We are the Cassandras of the 21st century. We see what is to come. We know the truth, but we are cursed that no one will ever believe us. We are doomed to stand on the shore and watch as the ship, carrying everyone we know and love, moves slowly but surely towards the reefs that only we can see. We can scream, wave our arms, light signal fires, but to the passengers on that ship, we are just strange, mad hermits on a deserted shore. And the most terrifying question that remains with us in this deafening silence is not what happens next, but are we next on the stage of this cosmic theater? Or are we just spectators in the front row, granted the dubious honor of seeing the finale of the play, without the ability to change it, or even to warn the actors that the curtain is about to fall? And what is more terrifying, to be a blind puppet or a seeing but paralyzed witness? This question remains open, and in this openness lies all the weight and all the tragedy of our knowledge. We know, and that is all we have, and it is all they can never take from us, and it is what will leave us forever alone. And so, the circle is closed. The journey down the rabbit hole, which began with a strange peak on a graph in the Arctic tundra, has led us to the foot of the icy mountains of existential dread. We have traveled from simple doubt in the official version to the construction of a complex, multi-layered worldview in which humanity is but grass on the battlefield of titans. We have not found final answers. Instead, we have found questions far larger and more troubling than those we started with. And in this, perhaps, lies the true purpose of any real investigation. Not to provide a comforting answer, but to ask the right, unsettling question. A question that will no longer allow us to sleep soundly. Let us one last time walk through the key points of our journey, not as detectives searching for clues, but as cartographers mapping the blank spots of our ignorance. What do we know for certain? We know that on May 12th, 2024, a series of events occurred whose synchronicity cannot be explained by chance. An anomalous energy pulse from space, a sudden activation of ancient microorganisms in the permafrost, and a perfectly scrubbed gap in the data from humanity's most powerful telescope. These three facts are not a theory. They are granite. They are the foundation upon which our entire edifice stands. We know that the official explanations for each of these events, from sensor failure to technical error aboard Webb, do not withstand scrutiny and are likely part of a coordinated campaign of information suppression. This is the second floor of our edifice, and we know, thanks to the data from Fort Detrick, that a physical, molecular mechanism exists, linking the cosmic signal and the biological response on Earth. A genetic lock tuned to that very frequency. This is the roof. Our building is complete. It is solid. But what lies beyond its walls? This is where the fog begins. We have hypothesized that 3I Atlas is not just a comet, but an artificial probe. But we do not know who built it or for what ultimate purpose. We have hypothesized that its interference in Earth's biosphere was not the first strike in a war against us, but an act of sabotage in someone else's older game. But we know nothing of the Sours or the hackers. Who are they? What are their goals? Are they enemies, rivals, or simply two different forces with different approaches to gardening in the galaxy? We do not know. We have hypothesized that the Hera mission to the asteroid Didymos is a disguised operation to dissect another potential artifact. But we do not know what they hope to find there. A key to technology? Information about the sours? Or simply confirmation that we are not alone? And most importantly, we do not know how this will end. What will happen when Hera reaches its target? How will the observer, positioned behind the moon, react? Is the Awaken virus a real threat, or just a diversion? And what is this ancient, long-term plan that was so crudely disrupted? Our main question, which at the beginning sounded like, what happened? Now, on a new, deeper level, sounds like this. Whose story are we living in? We are used to thinking that human history is the main and only play being performed on this planet. But what if that is not the case? What if we are merely secondary characters, extras in someone else's much more epic drama, the meaning of which we do not understand? What if our civilization, with all its wars, religions, and achievements, is just a ripple on the water, caused by a giant, invisible fish swimming in the depths? This realization strips us of our familiar pride, our anthropocentrism, but it also gives us something new, a new lens, a new way of looking at the world. It is with this new lens that we must continue to live. We must continue to observe. We must look not only at sensor readings and the spectra of stars, but at the silence between them, at the gaps in the data, at the anomalies in official statements. Because, as we have learned, the most important message is the one that was not said. The most important event is the one that was erased from the archives. We must learn to read this architecture of silence. We must ask questions, uncomfortable questions. Why was this publication delayed? Why was this project suddenly shut down? Why is the official version of this event so suspiciously simple? And most importantly, we must not trust easy answers. Any answer that completely removes anxiety, that neatly packs all the facts into a simple and understandable box, is most likely a lie. Reality, as we now know, is complex, convoluted, and full of frightening paradoxes. And any attempt to simplify it is not an act of enlightenment, but an act of control. Our investigation is not over. It is just beginning. And now, it is not just us leading it. You are leading it too. Every one of you who has followed this story to the end, who has felt the cold thrill of touching this mystery, has become part of the network of seekers. Now you too know where to look. You know what to pay attention to. And you know what questions to ask. The great silence of space is no longer synonymous with emptiness for us. We now know that it is full of whispers, hidden signals, and unseen movements. And our common task is to learn to hear them. Our watch continues, because regardless of who is writing this play, we are still on the stage. And as long as the lights are on, we have a chance to understand our role, or perhaps even to rewrite it. Observe, analyze, and don't let anyone tell you that you're seeing things that aren't there, because sometimes the shadows are all we have to judge the shape of the invisible object casting them.